Welcome to the Pre to Post Transplant Podcast, a podcast that brings personal stories from transplant survivors, their families, friends, and loved ones. This is where you will hear challenges and triumphs of everyone involved in this journey. Our guests will offer wisdom, advice, and inspiration on everything you want to know about transplant. My name is Jenny McFarland. I am a transplant survivor, and this is a podcast I wish I had before and immediately following my transplant. Thank you for listening. Hey everybody, this is Jenny McFarland. Welcome back to the podcast. I can't believe it's already almost Easter. It is the end of March and the time is just flying by. And before you know it, it's going to be the end of the year and we're starting all over again. I'm not complaining. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy for the days. Sometimes I wish time would go a little bit slower, but that's okay. So today's episode is pretty unique. It is about a heart transplant recipient, and his father was a heart transplant recipient when he was younger. So I will let him tell you his story, but I find it fascinating, and I can't wait for you to hear it. Just one thing I want to mention is to please leave a rating and review for the podcast. I still need more reviews. And I'm hoping that you leave a 5-star rating, but I will take what I can get. And if you want to leave a suggestion for an episode or want to be on the podcast yourself or know somebody who wants to be on the podcast, then visit the podcast website at www.pretopostTX.com. And you can find a page on there that will let you leave me a message. You can also subscribe to the podcast newsletter. I really don't have one yet. So if you guys have been subscribing and haven't been receiving anything, I haven't really sent anything out yet. So that's why you haven't gotten anything. But I plan to start doing that soon. I'm just trying to get everything together. So one more thing about the Pre to Post Transplant Foundation is we have a new program called the $7 Sunday, and it's just an easy way for you to contribute to the foundation and help members of our community just by donating $7 every month or every week, whatever you prefer. You can log on to the website and sign up and just know, as you're going along that you are helping people in the organ donation community. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out or log on to the website at www.pretopost.org and get some more information. It's a great, inexpensive way to contribute. So with that, I'm going to let my guest tell you his story, and I know that you guys are going to love this episode as much as I do. So without further ado, please help me welcome my guest, David Barber. Hi, David. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
I am so glad that you came on to share your story. Let me ask you first where you had your transplant, when you had it, and why you needed one.
When I had my transplant, I had a heart transplant August 10th, 2018. So coming up on 5 years this summer, and it was at the University of Kentucky. There were several factors that went into why I needed one, but just sort of basic congestive heart failure is probably the simplest way to put it.
Okay. So you had your transplant just a little less than a month before me. So we were right at the same time. Yeah, mine was September 6th of 2018.
No kidding. So 4 days.
Yeah. Or you had yours
just
August
10th.
After.
August 10th. It's funny because I guess we'll get into this, but I was trying to think of my father is also a transplant recipient, as you know. And my father's transplant date, I was trying to think of his. It was 9/9. His was 9/9/95.
Yeah, that's my wedding anniversary.
Oh, no kidding.
Well, not 95, but
95. Yeah.
Okay, very cool. Yeah, I do want to talk about that. So you had essentially congestive heart failure. Tell me about how that led up to that and how you found out about it and what kind of symptoms you were having.
Really, the first indication that anything was wrong was 8 years ago. Um, I had a stroke. It was July 4th weekend. I think the actual stroke date was on the 6th. Um, and it wasn't a massive stroke. But in fact, my significant other really didn't even recognize it. It was a Sunday afternoon. And I was supposed to go to the grocery and pick up some supplies. And laid down, took a nap. I didn't feel really great, but not terrible. And I stood up and I sort of knew something was wrong, but I couldn't really vocalize what was happening. Didn't just wasn't all the synapses weren't firing. So
Yeah.
I laid back down and actually slept like 3 more hours. This is not terribly uncommon for me, especially back then with the job that I had. At that time, for me to kind of take a lot of naps on my days off. So my significant other kind of just didn't think much of it. We went to bed that evening. I slept through the night, woke up the next morning, Monday morning, went to work, and I had speech aphasia, bad. I was answering the phone the way I would have done at my old job. Um, and the guys that I worked with looked at me and said, something's not right here. So I made an appointment with my family doctor. She got me in for a CT, an MRI the next day. So it was actually 2 days after I had the stroke before I was diagnosed with having had a stroke.
Yeah.
So went through that process, was in the hospital several days, but it recovered pretty quickly. The speech aphasia was really the major side effect of the stroke that I had. No long-term after effects. But I did see a cardiologist at that point. I was put under the care of a cardiologist who will play a pretty major role in the story. So, put on some beta blockers, put on blood thinners, sent home, take care of yourself. So that was July 4th weekend, and then that following, I was still under the continuing care of that cardiologist. So that following fall, wintertime, I started feeling really bad. Went to urgent care, family doctor, got diagnosed with all manner of upper respiratory infection, bronchitis, walking pneumonia, on and on and on. Of course, that is sort of telltale signs of congestive heart failure. It was just this constant cough, constant pressure in my upper chest.
Yeah.
And I was due for I'm trying to remember how this all went down exactly. But I was due to see the cardiologist. Cardiologist said, we need to do another a TE, a transesophageal echocardiogram. So they took a look, and at that point realized that I was in heart failure.
Oh, yeah.
So thankfully, the cardiologist that I saw as a result of my stroke is one of the best heart failure specialists in this area.
Mm-hmm.
So you'd never want to say it was lucky to have a stroke, but it was certainly lucky that I got to be put in front of him when I did.
Yeah.
Because he is really the one that sort of sent me down the path that I needed to go, long term. He looked at me, the day he looked at me and said, especially once I explained my father's history, I explained my father's history to him. He said that's, there are some things we can do with some heart failure drugs and some other things. But there's a pretty good chance you're headed towards a transplant yourself.
And so, did your father's transplant have to do with kind of the same thing that
Yeah.
yours did?
Yeah.
Yeah.
we don't have, or I don't have any siblings, and we don't have any children, so we've never done the genetic testing because whatever it
Yeah.
is is finished with me.
Yeah.
Uh, so so yeah, we haven't done the genetic testing, but the way that it came on, he was a little older when he was diagnosed with congestive heart failure. Although looking back, he was probably misdiagnosed. Similarly to how I told you with the
Yeah.
bronchitis and walking pneumonia diagnosis, and he lived in rural Kentucky. He didn't have the kind of access. He didn't have access to the kind of healthcare that I have here, close to Cincinnati.
Yeah.
Um, so he struggled for several years. So his congestive heart failure probably came on about the same age mine did.
Okay.
So it, the looking back, to his condition when I was in high school and my first couple years in college, he was sick,
Yeah.
and we kind of just struggled with what was going on.
Yeah. And so is your father still alive?
Yes, he is.
Okay.
He'll be 28 years post transplant this September.
That's
Still lives
nice.
independently, still does whatever he wants to do,
That's
travels quite a
amazing.
bit. Yeah,
Yeah.
pretty amazing.
Okay, so you realize they say, hey, you're probably going to need a transplant. I'm assuming that since you were already kind of familiar with the transplant process, that you already knew what you're going to go through. Essentially, you were a little bit more prepared than I would say the the person
I
who
would like to think
isn't.
so. Yeah, I definitely would like to think so. I mean, you know, dad was close to 20 years post transplant at that point.
Yeah.
So I kind of had this, you know, of course it's scary, but
Yeah.
with me in the back of my head, I have the best example you could ever have. I have
Yeah.
a person who has succeeded and thrived with a heart transplant.
Yeah.
So, I probably I probably was a little naive because,
Mm-hmm.
so many cases don't have such a positive outcome.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking, okay, we'll just find the best doctors we can. They'll do their magic, and
Yeah.
we'll be down the road. So,
Yeah.
I I never, you kind of make this decision. I think we all do, that we're going to do what we have to do
Yeah.
to stay alive.
Yeah. Sure.
And that's just how it's going to be. I can remember the surgeon that did dad transplant, was probably the most confident human being I've ever been around. And dad waited several months in the hospital, um, and it was pretty dire at
Yeah.
several different stages.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in fact, I don't. Are you familiar with LVADs,
A little bit.
left
Yeah.
ventricular assist device?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so he had one of the first LVADs ever.
Oh, wow. Okay.
He was, yeah, 95. That was pretty brand new technology. In fact, it was sort of, the LVAD that he had in 95 was like prehistoric compared to what they're putting in people now.
Yeah.
Um, so he had to go through that process, which I would eventually do myself. But anyway, throughout this entire process, his surgeon just said, "We're going to get a good heart. We're going to do this surgery," and that's how it is. That's how it is. There was never any wavering. There was never any doubt in his mind, which of course transferred on to all of us as family. I like to think it transferred on to dad, although I think he had many more dark days than he let on.
Yeah.
Um, but but yeah, just that sort of undying confidence that the job is going to get done.
Yeah.
So I take that 20 years later, and I try to make that part of my attitude.
Yeah, for sure.
So luckily, again, scary as all hell, right?
Yeah.
Scary, especially for like my significant other who was, we'd only been together a couple years at this point. So she didn't, she knew about dad's transplant, um, but that was kind of ancient history.
Yeah.
Um, so you can imagine how scary that would be coming in sort of without that knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah. I would think so. And then, she I don't know what she knew before, but she probably learned a little bit from you talking about your dad and meeting your dad.
Yeah, I
So,
think I think so. I think so.
yeah.
And then like I said, I had the best care you can get straight out of the gate.
Yeah.
So thankfully, again, the confidence of doctors. Dr. O'Brien from Christ Hospital here in Cincinnati, you know, he Christ Hospital did not have a heart transplant team at that point. They do now. In fact, I think they've been doing heart transplants for less than a year now.
Oh,
But they had the connections. They knew where I needed to be, so
yeah.
they got me. They got me to that point, and then when it was time to get to transplant, they pointed me to a proper team at University of Kentucky.
So how long did that process take after finding out you're going to need a transplant to actually getting one?
Well, so the next couple of years after the initial diagnosis, that we did treat it with the heart failure drugs and beta blockers and all of that good stuff. So I spent a couple of years and not feeling great. That couple of years was pretty rough. Still a lot of the upper respiratory kind of stuff. A lot of you just retain fluid.
Yeah.
Um, constant, and just kind of a constant cough, fighting with that. And then like I said, a couple winters down the road, my condition really got bad in a hurry, to the point where Christ Hospital didn't want to wait for me to get any worse. They didn't want to wait for me to go through the evaluation process and getting listed process. So Christ Hospital they did have an LVAD team, so we did an LVAD surgery in, let's see, that would be May of 2017 was when I got my LVAD. So after that surgery, you need a couple months to recover, before ideally you will have a couple months to recover before you start getting evaluated for transplant. So that's what we did. And then my care was transferred, from that stage on to the University of Kentucky. Uh, Once I was evaluated by UK, and officially listed, I think it was 10 months before I got the call that there was a heart available.
Okay.
So that was my actual wait time. I think it was 15 months from LVAD surgery to transplant surgery. The last 10 of that, I was officially listed.
Okay. And so it didn't get as bad as your dad. You said he was in the hospital for.
No, it was no. And while I was on the LVAD, I that was the LVAD was, it sounds cliche to say, but in this case, it's not. The LVAD was a lifesaver. Um, it's possible that I could have gotten listed and transplanted, quickly. I know that happens some. But again, the doctors at Christ Hospital erred on the side of caution, and I was really successful with my LVAD.
Yeah.
I was, once I completed, the cardiac rehab portion, I was on my own at the gym. I lost quite a bit of weight. Of course, a lot of that was water weight that I had
Yeah.
been accumulated because
Right. Yeah.
my heart wasn't able to flush all that fluid out. So yeah, I lost a lot of weight. Got pretty fit, even with an LVAD. I looked pretty wild at the gym with all those batteries and contraptions. But yeah, did that, and then I told the team at UK that my goal was to be the fittest person they'd ever done a heart transplant on. So they never confirmed whether that actually happened, but
Well,
I'd
that
like to
was
think.
a good mindset to have going in because
Yeah, yeah, but
so many people
and
don't.
I had some other patient mentors. Um, Gentleman named Bruno, who was also an LVAD, and he and I took a similar path. He was an LVAD patient at Christ, and then transplanted at University of Kentucky. Same path that I would end up on. And he
Yeah.
told me, every step that you take before transplant is every move, every activity, everything that you're able to do puts you in better shape and recovery for transplant.
Yeah.
And my recovery after transplant was a piece of cake compared to my recovery after the LVAD. I
Yeah.
was that was it was pretty remarkable,
Yeah.
honestly. How
Well,
much how much better off I was with that
yeah.
LVAD.
Well, I'm pretty sure every doctor tells their patients, you need to, you need to try to get into shape or as much as you can because that surgery is going to take it out of you. And they told me that. And not a lot of people realize how important it is to take that advice because I remember going into surgery. I was in surgery. I woke up. It was within 24 hours. And of course, the next day they got me up walking, and I couldn't believe how weak my legs were just from that short time because your body takes so much.
Oh yeah.
And I remember thinking, gosh, I wish I would have listened to them and tried a little harder to get a little stronger before surgery. But it's sometimes it's hard. It's just hard when you're sick. But yeah, it's like getting the exercise and getting the strength as much as you can before surgery is going to help you tremendously
Yeah, and
in the
I
beginning.
and pre LVAD, like I said, my condition got pretty bad pretty quick. But pre LVAD, I mean, walking up and down a flight of steps
Yeah,
was kind of a non-starter. It wasn't, we've got a 2-story house here, and I mean, part of it was because I was retaining so much fluid and couldn't lay down without my chest filling up. But I slept on the couch for like 2 years.
yeah,
And part of it was, and I remember this from my dad's, from my dad's situation back in the 90s. I knew if I called and he didn't return my call, I knew he was having a bad day. And I knew that because this will date, 1990. His answering machine was on the second floor of his house,
yeah,
and he hadn't gotten my message because he had been so exhausted after his work day that he hadn't gone to the second floor to listen to his messages.
yeah,
That's kind of, I've heard people talk about brushing their teeth, wearing them out.
yeah,
That's
yeah. I
kind of
mean,
that's kind of where you get when you're in that end stage heart failure place.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
It was the
I,
same for me with my lungs. We moved to Houston for my transplant. We bought a 2-story house, and luckily the master was on the first
First floor,
floor,
yeah.
and our office was upstairs. And my husband would spend a lot of time up there, and I would rarely go up there just because it hurt so much to go up. And funny story is, after my transplant, and I was able to go upstairs all the time and actually sit at my desk and work in my office, my husband and I ended up having to use one of the spare bedrooms as so we got separate offices because
Separate office,
we
yeah.
couldn't work in the same room. But it was like almost a year that we had the same office because I was never up there ever. So it's just funny, like that story. But yeah, like I couldn't walk upstairs. It was painful. I could barely
And that
walk.
was and that and that was always kind of my marker after that. That kind of became the marker for me, was like, okay, can you climb up a flight of steps? You know, I
Mhm.
you know after the LVAD and after the transplant both, when it was time for PT, I would ask. Plus, I knew I had steps right over here that
Yeah.
I knew I was going to have to navigate, and so I would always ask the PT, when do you think we can get some steps in? When do you think we can get in the stairwell and climb some stairs?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I distinctly remember, I had some kind of a weird complication, completely not heart related, but I had some pretty bad swelling and bruising on my upper thigh, um, because it's a long story. But anyway, it was tough for me to walk immediately after again, nothing having to do with the heart.
Yeah.
It was just a mishap during the surgery. But after it was actually after I was discharged from the hospital, I was still hurting in my upper leg bad. And finally, after about 10 days, we were staying at a hotel in Lexington, and Dad and I had gone out and walked around the parking lot and around kind of the little neighborhood there where the hotel was.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to climb the step. We were on the second floor, and I wanted to climb the steps up. And my leg felt a little better. So I remember getting to the top of those steps, and I'm like, this is a different game we're playing now. I felt pretty good with that LVAD. And here I am, 9 or 10 days after this transplant, and I feel a lot better. Like, I can't even put it into words how much, it was like flipping a switch.
Yeah.
Especially after that weird leg pain was gone. It was kind of the same deal with running. I'd kind of been a bit of a runner before. My significant other and I kind of started together, and we did a couple like 5Ks and stuff. And as I got sick, she went on with it, and she eventually did a couple half marathons while I was sick. And I was cheer squad while she was out running, and on their training runs, I would drive the car and try to provide support. But then after transplant, that fall, it was time to get busy again and try running for myself again. So
how long did it take for you to kind of, not counting the leg pain, but like with your heart, and how long did it take you to like fully recover and feel semi back to normal?
No time. I mean, it blows my mind to say this, but like no time. As soon as the sternotomy healed, as soon as they took the stitch, or as soon as it was staples, I had staples. As soon as they took the staples out of my chest incision, it was on. It was on.
Yeah.
So my significant other and my cousin's wife run together quite a bit. And I remember we went to the park one day, and I was just going to walk. They were going to, do their little 3-mile route or whatever they were doing that morning. And we started off walking together, and then they took off jogging, and I was like, I'm not jogging. I'm not walking anymore. I'm running with them. And I'm sure Kelly, I'm sure her heart stopped when she saw me doing that. And then a couple days later, right up the street here, we walked in the neighborhood. We've got a little 2-mile lap 2-mile route that we do around our neighborhood. And I ran the probably last 200 yards down the little hill here in front of our house. And again, I'm sure her mouth was on the floor, but I was like, and I think when the first couple times I jogged a little, 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, that kind of thing. I think I still had my chest staples in, But
Oh, wow.
once though, yeah.
I'm sure the doctors weren't too thrilled about that.
Yeah, yeah, what they don't know about. But
Yeah.
no, they, and thankfully, uh the guy who, he wasn't at the time. It was funny because the medical director of the transplant team was on vacation when I um when I got transplanted. So his temporary replacement while he was on vacation eventually became the medical director of the program. So he's the person I see. Um, he, especially in the early days, I was seeing him when I was going for visits and office visits, and he's a triathlete. He's done all kinds of crazy endurance stuff, so he gets it.
Yeah.
And so thankfully, and also my doctor from Christ Hospital, the original heart failure specialist that I saw is a marathoner. So luckily, I had people who understood these crazy cravings to get out and want to run.
Yeah. Yeah. I was kind of the same way. I mean, I'm not very athletic, but, um,
Oh, I'm not athletic. I'm slow. I'm
well,
slow. I
you,
just like to be out there.
I just, I'm a weightlifter, but I definitely don't like anything cardio and I hate running. And I'm huge. My husband and I are huge Christmas people, right? We're like people call us the Griswolds. And so I had my transplant in September, and in November I was up climbing on the roof with a harness, hanging Christmas lights and stuff. So people were just like, "You just had your transplant 2 months ago, and you're already up on the roof." And I'm like, "Well, I feel great, so why not?" You know?
Yeah.
So
I
yeah.
did I did something pretty weird. Um I don't remember exactly when I started it. I think I was able, so that, like I said, we've got this little 2-mile loop that kind of takes us around our immediate neighborhood. And I was able to do that 2 weeks after transplant, and I added a mile every week until I hit 13. So I did half marathon distance 13 weeks after my transplant.
Yeah. That's
So it
crazy.
was
That's awesome.
it,
I mean,
it
that's
was
amazing.
I think it was October. I think I did it on Halloween that year.
Wow.
That transplant. I didn't run it. I didn't run. I ran more than half of it, but yeah, I covered 13 miles, 13 weeks after my transplant.
Well, that's amazing.
Probably not something the doctors would recommend, but
Yeah.
I was lucky that I didn't have any doctors telling me not to do it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Hmm. Yeah.
Be as active as you can be, right?
Yeah. So what was your dad's take on you getting a transplant? Like, what did he have to say whenever he found out?
Well, my dad's pretty stoic. He's from that generation. He's pretty old school. He doesn't let much phase him. And, you know, I think it's hard. Again, he's not like me. He doesn't wear his heart on his sleeve, so to speak. So it
Yeah.
was hard to know. It was hard to know exactly.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's kind of it's it we talk more about it now. It's funny to compare meds with him and stuff like that.
Hmm.
And every once in a while they'll do a med change with him, and he'll say, "Have you ever been on such and such?" And
Yeah.
probably, luckily I haven't had to go through too many med changes. But he, yeah, he's mostly just there for support, and
Yeah.
um, yeah, he never really let on that it was anything. Of course, this was how he handled his own situation too, which again I think gives me some gave me some confidence in that moment. But he handled his situation as, I'm going to do what they tell me to do. um,
Yeah.
and we're gonna find the best doctors we can, and we're gonna let them do their job, and I'm just gonna be there and do what they say.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I don't want to say it's pretty cool that your dad and you both had a heart transplant, but like whenever you talk about your transplant to somebody new, you find yourself being like, well, my dad had one, back in the day, and now I have one. And you kind of tell both stories at the same time.
Yeah. Oh, for sure, for sure. That's what I used to do. I used to do some patient mentoring as well, like I mentioned before, about the gentleman who came into my room, my hospital room before my LVAD surgery. So I kind of wanted to pass that knowledge along, and I would start with Dad's story, because his story is way better than mine. Um, you know, even at that stage, when you're talking 20 years plus post heart transplant, there aren't many people that do that.
Yeah.
And getting close to 30 years now. So that's, his story is, again, and with the early day LVAD, and you
Yeah.
know like I don't most of the patients, and ironically, most of the patients I was mentoring in that time um were potential LVAD patients, or people who had just received an LVAD.
Yeah.
And they were calling, especially with younger patients, or people more my age patients. Those were the folks that the LVAD team thought that I should talk to, because they're probably on that similar path, headed towards a transplant. A lot of LVAD patients aren't necessarily headed towards transplant. That's kind of the end.
Yeah.
LVADs are sort of the bridge to their final destination. Um, but so, talking to other LVADs, I would always lead with that story,
Yeah.
um, because who better? I mean, there might be 100 other people in the world who have had a better transplant outcome than him,
Yeah.
and that's it.
Well, I find that, the 20 plus year recipients are so incredibly inspiring anyway.
Yeah.
So I love hearing that whenever there's somebody. In fact, right before this interview, I was perusing Facebook, and in one of the support groups, one of the lung ones, somebody was saying that they got their lung transplant. Gosh, I think it was like 24 years ago, and
Oh
that they
my.
they got it when they were 38. And I've heard about several, 20 plus transplants, and I always think, they're so lucky they had it, 24 years ago. And then I always think in the back of my mind that they were probably really young whenever they got it. And so to hear somebody say that they got it when they were 38 gives me a little bit more inspiration, because I was 39 when I got mine. So now I see that, there's still hope that maybe I can last, 20 plus years. And of course, medicine's always, evolving. So it's just so inspirational to hear somebody had their transplant so long ago, because those doctors give you such a short statistic, that you try not to
Yeah.
follow. But
Well, I'm a numbers person by nature. But thankfully, that's not something they ever did with me. We never. I can. You know, I I don't want to know. I don't necessarily want to know the statistics, because
right.
you know, thankfully, I was relatively young, um, for a heart transplant recipient. I was relatively healthy, other than the heart failure issues. Thankfully nothing else was wrong with my lungs, kidneys, liver. It was just the heart. Um, and then, and sometimes I wonder if I've dreamed this up or if this actually happened. But I remember in '95 with that situation, and I can't remember the source on this. I can't really remember even if it actually happened. But I remember somebody in '95 saying 5 years would be a good outcome for your dad. And
Yeah.
here we are 5 times that
Yeah.
plus. So, you know, statistics don't always, you don't make your own statistics in our case,
Mm-hmm.
but there are things that we can do to influence our outcomes. And that's what I like to focus on. I remember in a support, this is another thing. I remember we were talking about activity earlier, and this is something else that I picked up on in a support group in the early LVAD days. Somebody, and I'm also a control freak, and someone else in the group asked, okay, we're going to let you do your work, but what are the things we can control? What are the things we as patients can control as we go through this?
Yeah.
And the doctor had what I thought was a great answer. And he said, you can control the amount of physical activity you do to a certain extent. If you
Mm-hmm.
don't feel like, if you can't physically do anything, then you can't. But if you're physically able, have the mental fortitude to do some physical activity, you can control your diet, you can control your meds, that you take your meds as directed.
Mm-hmm.
You can control that you show up for your appointments when you're supposed to show up for your appointments. And then you can, control your attitude to some extent. And then also look out for your own mental health. And I thought that was a great answer. And I have kind of since that point tried to lean into those things. I'm still training for a half marathon this spring, but I'm probably not as active as I should be every day.
Yeah.
Um, my job is a little physically active, so I do have to kind of account for that also. I don't eat as well as I should. I do take my meds as I'm supposed to, I do follow, but I still try to be in control of those things as much as I can.
Yeah.
We don't eat out a ton. We cook in the house pretty healthily most of the time. I probably snack too much, and when we do eat out, I eat too much. But uh, but I do try to lean into those things and control what I can't control.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I have one more question for you, and it might be a little bit difficult question for you because of your dad, but maybe not. And I ask all my recipients this, and the question is, what piece of advice would you give to somebody who's pre-transplant that you wish you knew before your transplant? And
It would be
so,
those.
go ahead.
It would be those things we just talked about. Controlling the things you can control, and
Yeah.
and I would really add the the piece about uh, minding your own mental health. And I'm probably not using the appropriate verbiage here, but um, seeing a counselor, seeing a social
Yeah.
worker, seeing somebody who is an expert in that field, because this stuff's hard. Um,
Yeah.
the dealing with the having felt so physically bad for so long is hard. You lose control. I was pretty active, pretty strong guy, and for 3 years I couldn't do anything. And
Yeah.
then as I got that back, what does that, as I kind of gained agency over my own life again, then what, that's a trauma in and of itself. So, what, and then, you know, and then going through, if you've got if with your family, your partner, because it's probably worse on them than it is on us.
Yeah.
From the mental health aspect of it.
Yeah.
um you know so really do what you need to do to sort of keep your mind healthy as your body gets healthy again.
Yeah. 100%. I agree with that.
Yeah, that
Um,
was it was funny because my significant other was an amazing caregiver. And she would tell me, in some of my bad days, and some, especially like right after surgery, she would like, I couldn't do this. I couldn't do what you're doing. I couldn't be in the hospital for weeks, and I remember thinking, I couldn't do what you do. There's no way I could put myself second as many times as you have
yeah.
to take care of me.
Yeah.
Um, so that's the other thing, and you don't necessarily have to control that, but your caregivers are just as important a part of your recovery as anyone, doctors, yourself, anyone.
Yeah. For sure. Caregivers, they go through a lot.
It's amazing. I really can't understand. She must
Yeah.
really care about me.
I'm sure she does. Well, David, I appreciate you coming on and sharing your story and your dad's story. And I think that you guys are both inspirational and incredible. So
Thank you.
thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to the Pre to Post Transplant Podcast. Please be sure to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Facebook. Oh, and if you have not signed up to be an organ donor, please visit www.organdonor.gov and register today. You too can save lives.